I know lots of you have questions about travel, especially today, because from today a number of changes come into effect for passengers departing and arriving in Ireland. So it was a good time for us to contact our travel expert Eoghan Corry to ask him what happens from today. Good morning, Eoghan. How are you?
Good morning, Eiimear. Something thankfully a lot more cheerful.
Absolutely. And Eoghan, these rules that will apply throughout Europe, are things about to be simplified and to become much clearer for people heading off on their holidays this year?
Simplified is overstating it somewhat, Eiimear. What is changed is your vaccine, your second vaccine, your full course of vaccine. It became clear before Christmas it had a best buy date, and it's being renewed. It's been renewed by what we call the booster vaccinations. Actually, the politicians like calling it the third vaccination, but on the certificate it says the booster. So everybody will require one of these 9 months after their previous one. They don't require it from today. This is important. They do require it 9 months after they've had their full course of vaccination. For most Irish people, that kicks in sometime around Patrick's Day because most of the population got vaccinated their second jab around July. Healthcare workers would have already been in that situation, though.
OK, so passengers with acceptable proof of vaccination or proof of recovery in the last 6 months, will they now not have to show their pre-departure negative test result?
They didn't have to for travel within Europe. Tests were effectively abolished in July. Now they did come back. A couple of countries brought them back when Omicron raised its head before Christmas, including ourselves. Portugal, Italy and Greece did the same. Italy have dropped the demand from today, and I would expect Portugal and Greece both to demand. So the way we're about to drop their requirement. So the way it has worked, or it worked until just before Christmas, was you travel within the European Union without any testing. That's really important. If you're travelling beyond the European Union, it's still quite complicated. But with that digital COVID cert, you were allowed to travel without testing. There were questions raised first by the Czech Republic and then by Austria. They wanted to impose it 9 months after the second vaccination, or 6 months in one case.
Wow.
But Europe got together and said, let's do this together. And today is the day they're doing it.
OK. Now, in terms of other countries outside Europe then, I've had listeners tell me, Eoghan, they're quite confused. For instance, if they're going to Australia to visit family, different airlines seem to have different requirements.
Not only different airlines, Eiimear, but different destinations. What Australia did at the beginning of January was they had a very strict hotel quarantine for everyone system, and they dropped it in Sydney and in Melbourne, but they kept it in Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide. What we've seen since is slight tweaking of regulations across the 6 states. Well, there's 5 states with, 4 of them have direct flights. I suppose Darwin doesn't from Singapore doesn't really count for Irish listeners. But it's hard to follow because there's sort of a little bit of conflict between the Melbourne policy and the Sydney policy. You know, one is better, one considers themselves a little bit superior to the other. That's the way Australia works, and the way that impacts on us is that it's very hard to work out what the coherent policy is. What I would recommend to listeners is that the airlines will be pretty much up to date. Emirates, Qatar, and Etihad are the 3 of choice flying from Ireland that most people flying to Australia do, and they're pretty much on the ball on that. They'll get up-to-date information on that. But another thing about Australia is I noticed the price is still high, and the reason is so many Australians got stranded abroad. It'll take them months to repatriate all their own people, never mind Irish people trying to get in, and the reconnection of families. That has been really, really devastated since the beginning of COVID. OK.
Lots of questions coming in for you, Eoghan. I'll dip into some of them. Please ask Eoghan, what about people not vaccinated, but if they have a COVID recovery cert, or people with both vaccinations but got COVID and have a COVID recovery cert?
COVID recovery cert will get you through. The very important, Eiimear, it's not the scientist who's going to be assessing this, or even an immigration official. It's going to be somebody at the gate, at the airline gate. they're the ones who look at your documentation and say, you can board the flight. If you don't have documentation that meets their standards, you're not getting on board. That makes it a little bit more difficult because you really are dealing with pieces of documentation they need to be familiar with. COVID recovery cert would fall into that category, but anything more complicated, you bring as much support documentation as you can with medical backup. It's very simple. If you can't get vaccinated, as a lot of people can't through anaphylactic reactions and things like that, if you can't get vaccinated, you will need to test, and it's not a PCR test, it's an antigen test, and it's pretty straightforward. You get it much more quickly than the PCR test. It can be done at the airport and fly out.
OK, I noticed the prices coming down as well, Eoghan, for people getting the private PCR or the private antigen tests. Definitely more kind of competition and movement in the market there now.
It's halved, Eiimear. It was 90, it's now around 50. It spiked terribly there when the PCR tests in general came under pressure around Christmas. But the price didn't go up. What happened was all the slots got filled. But PCR is still required. For instance, Canada requires a PCR. America requires an antigen. We've had people refused at the gate in Dublin Airport, flying to Florida through Toronto, which a lot of people do, because they could get to Florida all right with their antigen, but they couldn't get through Toronto without a PCR.
So you must be mindful of that if you're on a stopover, even, Eoghan, that you need a PCR for Canada.
It's a wee bit complicated. Even the stopover is complicated, yeah. OK,
and we had a number of listeners asking about what's the story for travelling to Canada. So I think you've answered that now in terms of them needing
the Canada
PCR.
locator form also comes up with a little tripwire. It asks you not just the date for your second vaccination. Most locator forms look for the date of the second vaccination. It asks you the date for your first vaccination as well.
OK. Kay is wishing you a happy St. Bridget's Day, Eoghan. She's also asking about the rules for visiting England. So lots of our listeners looking to do a hop, skip and a jump to England there. And is there anything they should be aware of?
Oh, Lá Bhríd, Hannah lots of féin, Kay. It's a wonderful saint. I think she should be celebrated internationally. She was bigger than St. Patrick internationally, or right up to the 1300s when St. Bridget of Sweden was born and named in her honour. But going to England, uncomplicated. No locator form going out, a locator form coming back, and it's pretty seamless. There aren't that. One thing to keep an eye on is people have trouble getting their passports back, particularly for young newborn babies. First-time registrations, there's a bit of a backlog. If you fly Ryanair, you need a passport, but going to Aer Lingus still, you can get there on a driving license. So it's. Getting to England is the least complicated travel we're going through at the moment. Coming back, you will need a locator form. There will be airline requirements as well. It's always a good idea to have the COVID cert to get on board an aircraft, because of individual airline requirements can be a little bit different from the national ones. OK.
Do you think families will experience confusion when they're going on their fairly predictable family holidays across Europe to all their familiar destinations? Will there be any spanners in the works, do you think? Are there any particular countries that might have different rules, for instance, that are worth mentioning, or some may even find the passenger locator form confusing for them?
Confusing is the word. Passenger locator forms look for things. The Spanish one, let's face it, most 70% of us go to Spain and Portugal for our summer holidays. The Spanish one looks for the municipality. That would be, Cambrils would be in a different municipality from Salou, and there's very little difference between the two. They look for postcode on the Portuguese one. A lot of lads that I would know that went out to Santa Ponsa wouldn't know what country they were going to, never mind what municipality. So they're the sort of things you need. A lot of them look for the date of the second vaccination. And that means that, it's not to be done 2 minutes before you're going out the door to go to the airport. It's something that you probably need to collect and get together. There's no doubt it's more complex than it used to be for families. For instance, Italy requires vaccinations over the age of 6. Most countries require them over the age of 12. I think Greece is the same. It's over the age of 6. There is one app and website that collates all the European Union information under the auspices of the European Union, and that's the reopeneuropa.eu website and app. It's the official European Union one. When you Google travel regulations, you get a cacophony of people, some of them trying to sell you things and some people giving conflicting information. But that's the one that works, reopen.europa.eu for travel within the European Union. What I would like to see happening before summer, and what the European Union is pressing for, is that all the regulations are exactly the same through the 27 member countries, but we're still a little bit off that. The other thing with families is making sure that passport, family, that scene in Home Alone where they're counting them in the car, and counting the passports for the family members, the one that shows up that's out of date. It used to be 3 years that the child's passport expired. It's now 5 years. That's a little bit of a help. A renewal of a passport is going through fairly quickly when it can all be done online and you can track it online. But new registration's a little bit of a problem. One important thing, Eiimear, is you don't have to wait for the PPS number for the child. You can apply as soon as the child is born, and that could take pressure off the end of that process, the end of that cycle. And once you have, it takes a little bit longer. Support documentation, you used to have to send the original passport in with the support documentation. One of the things the DFA has eased is a photocopy will do, because we had a lot of situations with people with the parents' passports still not back, and the child's passport had already arrived because the support documentation hadn't been returned. So all of those things, small little tweaks here and there. It's still not 2019, but it's less. It's not as complicated as it was.
A flood of texts now, Eoghan, so we'll try and fly through. Yeah. And I'm sorry, the rapid fire round in all these different countries. But if you have any general advice, listener wants to know about Poland. If there's anything you can say about Poland. Somebody else is asking about Madeira.
Poland, fine, locator form, and we have very ambitious schedule. We have 58 flights a week in from Dublin to Poland.
No PCR requirement.
No PCR requirement, no antigen requirement if you're double vaccinated.
OK, so that's an answer for that listener. And do you know anything about the island of Madeira for June, July? Somebody's off somewhere nice.
Great news. Madeira has a direct flight. It's got direct flights from Ryanair for the first time. And we had a weekly flight for many years. It came to a halt a couple of years ago. It's still there. Now, Madeira's regulations are the same as the rest of Portugal. At the moment, you need an antigen test flying in. I think that might have been done in the run-up to the Portuguese election, but Antonio Costa got re-elected. He'll be a happy man since Sunday, so it's like I would imagine he'll remove that. So Madeira is it's slightly different regulations as the Azores had during winter, but they are now aligned completely with Portugal. OK.
Somebody wondering, driving to and from England, any requirements?
No, your locator form is still required coming back into Ireland. Everybody forgets the locator form coming back into Ireland. You see them in Dublin Airport filling them out madly, but there's no extra requirements, requirements beyond what we had in 2019.
And a final one from a listener. We've a few actually asking about Sydney, and I know you've touched on some of the rules in Australia, but we might get you to go over Sydney.
Sydney has the way it worked for nearly 2 years was there was a cap on the number of what the Australians did was daft. They put a cap on the number of people who could arrive by aircraft to Sydney and to their airports. They removed that cap January the 6th. And they removed the hotel requirement that you have to stay in a hotel if you're double vaccinated. Everything applies if you're double vaccinated. So Sydney up and running. But as I say, Australian health policy, and they have an election coming up, always a bad combination because politicians sort of compete to be stricter on international travel. And sadly, it makes them look strong and they get votes out of that.
All right. And OK, I'm such a softie because I just know people are dying for more info. This is the very last one, I promise you. But there's a few asking about regards COVID certs, for instance, when you go to Tenerife, people going there in June and wondering about not just getting there, but as regards getting out and about and all of that. Are they looking for COVID certs?
Very simple, bring your COVID cert everywhere. Tenerife is on level 4 at the moment. Lanzarote and Gran Canaria are level 3. That means the COVID cert is required. In some places, masking outdoors is required. And while the websites will deliver the national information, like reopen.eu will deliver the national information, the local authorities are imposing their own restrictions. Masking outdoors is mandatory, as I speak, in Malaga, for instance.
Wow, OK, good to know. Thank you so much for all the info this morning, Eoghan, Corry, agus Lá, Éile, Bhríde, Honachit, and lovely mention for St. Bridget as well. Thanks for that.
Míle magat, Eiimear.
Slán go fóill to Eoghan.
Weekday mornings from 10 till 12. This is KCLR Live.